Yeah, it's the comments.
I've got mine. Okay, I've got mine anyway. So, were there any that you didn't understand? Were there any you didn't understand?
I didn't understand. Because here you said I should this one.
Oh, just a point while you're going through, because I wasn't sure it was my computer, but sometimes you've got paragraphs in boxes and sometimes you haven't, and you've got different fonts changing and things like that. So you need to just make sure it's consistent in terms of how it's laid out. Yeah, so you need to make it clear to the reader. So basically, the person who's reading this will have no idea, what you've done before. They're coming to this from nothing potentially, and so you need to be able to explain to them all the time what you're going to, what you're doing and why you're doing it. If you read a textbook, quite often the reader will finish a chapter saying, in this chapter we looked at this, and this, and we found out this, and this. In the next chapter we will move on and think about this and this. And then every time, and then they start the next chapter saying, right, in this chapter we're going to introduce. So they're continually signposting to the person who's reading it where you are and why they're telling you about the thing that they're doing. What you don't want to do is just put all this down because it's designed to show how much work you've done. What you need to do, it's about the journey that you've taken in terms of coming up with the idea that about your design, and how you've thought through your design through the case studies, through the literature, and through your design thinking. And so it's that journey that you're trying to document in this. So you need to tell people all the time. And you start off with it quite well. In the first few paragraphs you say, and I did this because I thought this was useful. And I think you need to do that on every single section.
So because at this I have said the traffic is it's really I think it is the introduction. That is it not?
But you're saying, yeah. So but you're is it clear that that's but you're still trying to relate it back to your research theme as well, when why is it answering your research theme? So you might say something like the research theme is looking at how we can make spaces more playful. One thing that has become apparent in that a barrier to this is often perceived as high levels of traffic, and so it's just starting off the paragraph with perhaps something about where we came from the past chapter, and saying how it links to your research theme.
I should write something that includes this theme.
Well, you could say that now we've done this. Now we would think about this. That links that moves the argument along, moves you onto a different topic, that takes the reader by the hand and moves them from one part to the other. It's sort of, we've done this now, and now we move on to
because this is important.
Yeah, and this is important because of
so I include the
yes,
right, I didn't include the link.
Then to link to the previous, and also to your research question. That's the thing. You just make sure it's all right saying children's traffic safety is important, and it's and generally you would expect children's traffic safety, but something to say, something in there that was said. It would be impossible to consider the use of urban spaces for play without the consideration of how traffic might be managed, and then you go on to that. You see that it's a general statement saying this is why it's important for this. So it's something just something simple like that. It's important, it would be, it's important to consider as part of the traffic, the traffic as part of the play or something like that. Or think of something. It would be difficult to consider this thing without considering children's play. or something like that. Just to link it in to what you're doing. So does that make sense?
Yes,
yeah. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay. So yes. And this one.
I don't use the boxes.
The,
Listen, play again. You're talking about sociability. Again, what's the link? Is it about parents within the street also being sociable? You can say that it might be that play can't be considered in isolation. It's it is it is unlikely that that play would be able to take place without other social interactions happening within that particular street. Therefore, it is useful to be able to look at some of the aspects of what makes streets sociable in general. The other argument is the one that I've mentioned before, is that the social life of streets is an area that has been widely looked at by urban designers, but rarely do they consider in that process the aspects of play.
Because the lack of this is the social street, and from this chapter I find the gap that because it has the soft edges that encourage people to stay outdoor, but these soft edges are just for the adult scale, not for the children's scale. So I think it is initially that didn't have some link between the play and so I find the gap.
Yeah. So put that in. Yeah. Say that specifically. I think.
And my research methodology, because
it's the same.
yes. Sorry. Because I use for my two case studies, I
observation data.
So should I use one paragraph to write?
Yes. Put a bit about using observation, what you did, how long you were there for, what time of day you were there for, how did you record what you were doing. Did you talk to people? Did you just watch them? Did you photograph them? Did you draw? All those sorts of things. Sometimes with observation you take a 2-minute window and record who's there in that 2 minutes, and then you come back in an hour and do it again. So it's those sort of notes about what you actually did.
So you said that this is something I don't really say what I did because this part.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So that needs to go in.
So if I actually.
Although it's actually this is the results to some extent.
Yeah.
You need to be able to say, I went and sat in a number of Van Eyck's play areas. I sat in each one for 20 minutes and observed how the young people were using the space. And you might say, well, I was looking out for X, what things you were looking out for, or it's basically what you did and why you did it when you were there.
So okay. So I don't need to. This is not useful. I just.
That's a description of it. So you then so you say, well, I chose these as my sites. Why did you choose them as your sites? And so that description should help explain why you chose.
So in the methodology, should I say the reason that I choose my site is in the part of the case study or in the part of the methodology? No, it shouldn't in the methodology.
In the methodology, you say, well, part of the methodology was that I went and visited some sites, and I then did this when I visited. I chose these particular sites. The reason I chose these sites was because, and then some of that might explain why you use the sites. But and then rather than just describing it because of you might actually, that's a very brief description, so it's probably quite useful to have a brief description. I think some pictures would be useful in there at that point as well.
I should add some pictures
of the case studies, yes, at that point, just so people know what they're looking at. Just
I mean that in this part I have explained some brief description of why I chose this study.
Yeah, where, why, and why you chose it. Yeah.
Yes, I mean this part it should be in the methodology part or in the.
Why? Yeah, I mean, the see, I'm not entirely sure that methodology is in the right place here, because I think your first literature review is part of the methodology, in which case it should be before the first literature review.
Mm.
So you basically I would say you put it right at the front, because the first part of it should say, this is why I'm interested in it, this is what I actually did, and possibly even summarise what you included. But in that you say, right, so we started off, the first aspect was to review how whatever your first literature review, review the topics there. I then used that literature to help inform some case study visits that I made, using techniques of observation. So you might summarise it at the introduction. I'd almost be inclined to put the methodology for the case study themselves at the start of the case studies. How you did the case studies at the start of the case studies rather than sort of in a separate chapter, because it makes it easier for the reader to see, oh yes, that's what you did, and this is how I did it, and that one point. So. And there's loads of different ways of ordering it, but you can. But I think I'd be tempted to just put it at the start of those. Having said that, I'm a devil for writing these things and then moving them at the last minute. So.
And this is the same problem of that you have.
Yes, fine. And it's just keeping the reader informed about why what you've done is relevant, and it's just making their life easier, basically. They've got to mark it.
And because the last review, I didn't have the link between the case study and the literature review and the design. So now this is I haven't finished my first case study, but this is this one. I choose I conclude from the first literature review from this thesis.
Yeah.
And then in my case study, I analysis some special quality of the safety, natural surveillance, and the parents' activity to respond this thesis.
Yes, I think that sums up very nicely, and I would move that earlier on. I would have that in your introduction, right at the beginning, because that sort of summarises. I think you need to get that right. That's actually as your research question. Put your research question in there.
Your research question here.
Yeah. Just make it. But but yeah. So that sort of shows how it all fills. What you haven't got in this is perhaps some what we call feedback loops. Where we're just saying, well, actually, I looked at my design proposal. What does it mean in terms of those? So you can feed back. Sometimes you can have perhaps have another arrow going back up there, because you will evaluate your scheme using these things here, and perhaps.
So after I finish my design, I should evaluate.
Yes, you can use your scheme. You can evaluate your scheme using some of these things, perhaps in the same way that you evaluated your case studies.
And I have a question that these elements is the case studies to prove these elements.
Yeah, the case study is to you've highlighted these points. Yeah. These are the aspects that you should be using to help structure your case studies. The headings. The headings for the case. So you should be able to think about each of your case studies in terms of location surveillance, what the traffic situation is like, the play equipment, the play space for different groups. I would have always put in there something about you know, I suppose abstract play equipment is what you mean, because abstract play equipment basically isn't a swing or a slide. It's a pond or a wall or a hole in the ground or something like that the children will do what they want with, I suppose. I wonder if that's the right term. I wonder if it should be play opportunities.
It should be changed as
play opportunities perhaps. But you'll explain it later in there anyway, because these will be explained, won't they, as part of your literature review anyway.
Play opportunities. So play opportunities should cover these two elements.
No, play space for different age groups is one, but you know the equipment. This is always equipment. It's a wall, a piece of equipment.
You think people may be confused if it is the slide or the swing?
Yes, I think so. The way you've written that at the moment, yeah.
This one is it clear?
It's really, well, you've not spelled defensible space right. It's defensible. It's the wrong way. You need to get this proof. You'll need to have everything proofread if you can. Get someone to proofread.
Sorry. Oh yes, this is.
And you know, in transition zone between residential. Should you have in there something about public? I mean, I talk about. Is it about, you know, just as much about public to private?
Here.
Yeah.
So, here.
Yeah. I mean, these things here, I can't tell you whether they're wrong or right. These are things that you will have to have determined from reading the literature. So if you found these in the literature, they will be right. You know, they'll be good enough to put in there. As long as you can back them up in the literature, then that's fine. So I can't tell you whether they're wrong or right. I can suggest you might word them differently, but I think there's probably something in there about private versus public spaces. You know, you can have some spaces where someone might want to be sociable, other spaces where someone might just want to go and sit and quietly read a book or drink a cup of coffee or something like that. And different spaces, and they might be in a smaller space where you go and read a book, but bigger spaces that are more, you know, the market space where everybody's getting something said. So it's that. It's not just transition zone between residential building and street. It's also between private and public.
Because my final design is the back lane, so
yeah.
Because I think
even there, you've got some bits which are on the lane, and some bits which are off. And the bits on the lane will be much more public, but you might have some quiet little alcoves where people can go and sit, which are just off the lane. So you're going to have some bits which are public and some bits which are much more private.
That some bit is the more private and some is the public.
Yeah.
So this is not should just conclude the because I just conclude this small space. I didn't mention this space.
Yeah, you've got to know what's the difference between them. I mean, you had. When I saw you 2 weeks ago before the crit, you showed me a different version of this with various areas marked up and drawn out. You didn't really see it at the crit, so it wasn't as clear at the crit. Have you still got that drawing? Have you still got the drawing where you showed how that was actually made up?
Yes, I have.
Crikey. Yeah. And I'm not entirely sure, but yes, because then. Because I think 2 weeks ago you showed me this as a hand drawing rather than one that was.
Yes, it's the hand drawing.
Hand drawing, and I think the hand drawing was better than this.
So in my final submission, I can draw the line in the hand drawing.
Well, you can, if you're confident enough to do it in hand drawing. That's absolutely fine. I think the hand drawing said much more about the spaces you created than this did. So I would say, you know, bring that one back out, because I think it loses something when you have everything the same line weight, and it doesn't have the same character. You don't get the feeling for what the spaces are like from that drawing, whereas the one that you had for the tutorial just before, which was hand drawn, was much better.
Oh yes, so it's not the problem. Is not the content. It's
the way it's presented.
It's the way of presenting.
Yeah, and I think it isn't necessary to have everything done in CAD if it comes over better as hand drawing, and you draw nicely. So make the most of it.
So from the every point for the 3D perspective, like this vision, should I draw like the college one or this one?
Oh well, I think those are much nicer drawings than these ones in terms of what they're like. So you'd be much better off. I know it would take you longer, but these are much nicer drawings.
So in my final design, I can use this.
Yes.
Oh,
oh gosh, yes. Yeah, don't. This sort of thing was nice.
Can I use them?
You can use that, yeah.
Oh, I just think it's the sketch stage.
Sketches are fine.
Oh, okay.
To give us an idea of what you're wanting to achieve. No, those sort of little things are lovely. So yeah, don't not use them because you think they're not finished. So yes, we're not. This isn't a course in how to present using hard lines on a computer, and then it's not an engineering course. So you can do it, but if you're going to a client and you show them that or these, they're going to be much more excited about looking at that than that. Yeah, that feels unnatural. That feels natural. So yes, don't do that. No.
Okay, so after seeing my this do you think I have maybe? I
think yes. I think it's fine as long as what's there is what you got out of your literature review, and this is almost like a contents page for what you're doing in this. So I think it's a nice summary of how it works.
So I should have a paragraph to explain it.
You should do, yes, and that would be your introduction.
Introduction.
Your introduction.
But introduction, I think it's the background of the.
Yeah, well, your introduction should be the context. It should then say what you've done and how what you're doing is structured.
So it should in the introduction part.
Yeah, you can explain to the reader what they're going to expect to see in the rest of the document.
Okay. And you see that this one should do.
I think a dotted line back up there would talk about how you might make that a continue. So you're almost saying, well, actually, I'm testing my design and making changes to it. So.
And I have a problem now because these are the good elements, good thesis, and I conclude some good thesis for my design. I'm afraid that I can't have something that prove they are not right in my.
You can.
Design.
You can if you want. If you think, I don't think you're ever going to prove that something's not right. What you might find is that something's not useful.
Not useful.
That you don't need it for what you're doing. I mean, what you can be doing is, as a result of this, and I think what might be missing from here is somewhere across here is a set of guidelines, a set of good practice guidelines, a set of things that you think it's important if you were building if you were advising someone, saying, right, someone said to you, right, I want to design a street which is really, the route to my new school. I want to be able to think about how do we get the children down there, how do we encourage play on the way there and back. You need to be able to come up with a set of guidelines. These are the things that you need to think about if you are going to do this.
Guideline is in this framework.
Yeah, you could put the guidelines at the bottom in between there in your design. And then you use your design as examples of those guidelines, and then you can test it. Well, actually, that isn't really working, so you change your guidelines. So it's you can come up with a set of, and those guidelines are actually quite useful. They could become part of the conclusions of your research. What comes out at the end of it is something that someone else will find useful.
Okay. And for my case studies, the title I should maybe include this to divide my title, to use them to divide my headings.
I think, where did these come from?
This is my finding after my. This is the new finding, and
I think you should be including all of those headings in those case studies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when I like this, because like this is the traffic-free analysis, and when I analyze that, I say yes, it's good, and it is respond to the literature review.
What the thing, of course, you've got to think about is you would have analysed some of that using some of these headings as well, wouldn't you?
Using this.
You'd have thought about, when you were there, you'd have been thinking about this as well, wouldn't you?
No.
You didn't. Okay.
I didn't. I just this.
Okay. Okay. And it just what bits of abstract play equipment are in Hallmere Hootenham? It might you might get asked that. So it almost would make sense to have all of the headings for both case studies. But some might not have been apparent. But
so my question is that when I analyze this, should I prove they are right? Or
no, you don't need to prove they're right.
I don't need to prove they're right.
No, that's what other people have done already.
Yes, they are right. So I just see it is how it is used.
You have to say that they're appropriate to answer your research question. They are necessary to help you answer your research question. That's all. There's no right or wrong. It's, are they going? And I think they probably are. These are issues that are relevant to understanding how we can create safe social spaces. These are the things that you've got to think about.
So should I in each title the end of the text I should respond, or just on conclusion of each case study to conclude the relationship between, or must one by one should?
I think what you do, you take the most important ones that are particularly relevant. So you might find that your case study actually only really talks about location and surveillance, and says, well, actually the traffic-free thing is probably something that they could have thought about, but they didn't really. It's limited to, you don't have to put them necessarily. Don't try and put something under every heading if there's nothing to put under a heading. Don't write something for the sake of writing it. Just write what's, use that as guidance to help you think about what you write.
Okay. I don't have other problems.
Okay. Right, do you want to see me again on probably Monday next week?
Yes.
And it would be Monday at 3 o'clock, is that okay?
3 o'clock. Okay.